Yeah, and I was like,
I was afraid to actually say it. It was horrible traffic.
Maybe after. So I think
yeah. So he goes a bit hard, a bit of over. Of course, that out of workspace. And I also got a quick so it was a really
I don't know you guys that well, so I might get about $20. So like
welcome everyone. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving and recovering from turkey and whatever else you had over the weekend. We're very happy to have you here today. For a lecture by one of our dissertation fellows, Burkay Ozturk. And I just want to make a couple of announcements before we start. Our next fellows lecture will be in the new year, in January. Daniel Sutherland from the philosophy department will talk about Kant's mathematical philosophy. And then in the spring, we're going to be hosting Richard White, a historian from Stanford University, as our visiting fellow for the year. He'll be here for 3 days talking about different issues in environment and narrative. And everyone is invited to join us for reception after the lecture today. It's our end of the year holiday reception. I know it seems like how can that be happening so soon? And now I'd like to ask Joshua Norton, who is a fellow graduate student in the Department of Philosophy, to introduce our speaker.
Since I'm not the speaker, I don't know if I'm supposed to stand here or you may, I don't know.
Stand wherever you'd like.
But I am pleased to be able to announce our speaker for today. He is a great friend of mine and a very good scholar. Burkay studied physics and philosophy as an undergraduate at Bilkent, one of Turkey's premier universities. So as we all are recovering from Turkey. Perhaps Burkay never has. His current areas of research include philosophy and methodology of science, but he is also interested in philosophy of logic, mathematics, epistemology, philosophy of religion, and a whole gamut of other things. His current research projects include pessimistic induction and evidence ex silico. This is the work he's doing for his dissertation, as well as pessimistic induction and the non-random sampling fallacy. He has a paper he's working on called Can Computers Provide Evidence Without Representing Quasi-Particles and Numerical Simulations. I don't know what this paper is about, but it sounds interesting. This one's titled Of German Tanks and Scientists, a Bayesian Argument for the Problem of Unconceived Alternatives. I don't think he's talking about that, but that'd be fun for you to talk about, Burkay. Then the last one, so he does a lot of stuff in philosophy of science, but he does lots of other things in terms of epistemology and philosophy of religion. So there's this paper out, a new a priori argument for atheism, and I think he's actually trying to get this one published in different places. The talk that he will be giving us today is inspired by Paul Feyerabend. I'll be interested in seeing how you pronounce his last name. And this paper deals with the intermingling of science and society. So it'll be a good topic for a mixed group like ourselves. With this, I turn the floor over to my friend and our speaker. Thank you. Thank you,
Josh, and thanks everyone for coming today. I will start the talk with boring slides, but with 2 videos.
I don't oppose Islam as a country. I don't oppose Islam as a country, but I do feel that their laws should not be welcome here in Australia. Less than 2% of Australians follow haram.
Or the Quran, as the Islamic text is known. Kosher food for Jewish Australians is fine.
Jews aren't under haram, they have their own religion which follows Jesus Christ.
Judaism rejects Jesus Christ. Just like Islam, it has its own dietary law and food certification.
They don't have a tax on it, they've just got a certain way of making it, where haram has a tax on the food.
Kosher has a fee too.
NDIS, where do you stand on that? Do you want the National Disability Scheme?
I believe that the disability scheme is working at the moment.
It doesn't start until 2016.
So this was very lovely Stephanie Bannister, who was one of the candidates in Australian federal elections this year. After this interview, she withdrew herself from the I want to show you another video before I move on to explaining why this is relevant.
Good morning. Let's try again, shall we? This is called adding. If I have 2 beans, and then I add 2 more beans, what do I have?
Some beans.
Yes. And then. Let's try again, shall we? I have 2 beans, then I add 2 more beans. What does that make?
A very small casserole.
Already, the 8 creatures of the Indus have mastered this. Try again. 1, 2, 3, 4. So how many are there?
3.
What?
And that one.
3 and that one. So if I add that one to the 3, what will I have?
Oh, some beans.
Yes. To you, Ulrich, the Renaissance was just something that happened to other people, wasn't it?
Edmund, come quickly, the Queen wants to see you.
What?
I said, Edmund, come quickly, the Queen wants to see you.
What are you wearing round your neck?
Ah, it's my new ruff.
You look like a bird who's swallowed a plate.
It's the latest fashion, actually, and as a matter of fact, it makes me look rather sexy.
To another plate-swallowing bird. If it was blind and hadn't had it in months.
I think you may be wrong.
You're a sad, laughable figure, aren't you, Percy? What do you think of Percy's ruff, Ulrich?
4. Some beans and some beans is 4.
No, we've moved on from advanced mathematics. We're on to elementary dressmaking. What do you think of Percy's ruff?
I think he looks like a bird who swallowed a plate, my lord.
No, that's what I think. That's what I think. What do you think? Try to think, Ulrich. Thinking is so important. What do you think?
I think thinking is so important, my lord.
Ulrich, let's try.
Okay. So, the reason why I wanted to show you these 2 other humorous videos, I hope, is that they illustrate very well, in my opinion, 2 failures of critical thinking. Stephanie Bannister, that we observed in the first video, the candidate for the federal elections in Australia, forms her own opinions, but apparently without any factual information. Baldrick, on the other hand, who is the character in this awesome British comedy series, Blackadder, if you haven't seen it, you should see especially the 2nd and 3rd seasons you are missing out. Instead of forming his own opinions, ignorantly maybe, he blindly follows the opinions of a perceived authority. He just repeats what his Lord Blackadder tells him. If the Lord Blackadder says, Percy is ridiculous, he says Percy is ridiculous. If Lord Blackadder says thinking is so important, he says thinking is so important. So nowadays, too many important medical decisions are made by ignorant Stephanie Bannisters. and highly educated boulders. Many medical doctors, as well as the majority of patients, are unquestioningly following an external authority, namely randomized clinical trials published in peer-reviewed medical journals. Some patients do the opposite and form opinions about vaccines, drugs, and treatments without having any factual information on how and why they do or do not work. When I make this claim in the presence of real medical doctors, I imagine none of you is a medical doctor here. Are there any medical doctors here? Okay, good. I get reactions ranging from mild irritation to utter perplexity. Yes, they all agree. There are some Bannister-style patients out there, and most medical doctors think that those patients are a pain in the neck, to put it mildly. They also tell you that most patients are not like that. They listen to medical science. And listening to medical science is what one ought to do, according to these doctors and their more educated patients. We are not like Ozturk. We do not blindly follow an external authority. They reassure me. And they ask, how could there be anything wrong with doing what is recommended by randomized clinical trials published in peer-reviewed scientific journals? After all, isn't science how you find the truth? And they give me a piece of advice. They say to avoid being a Miss Bannister yourself, in order to avoid forming opinions without factual information, you must believe science. The situation in medicine is not really an exception among other sciences. Today, acceptance of science as the supreme arbiter of almost all truths is accepted by not only scientists themselves, but also by most people, lay people. Almost everyone wants and believes science to be on their side, from the leaders of religious movements to the outspoken, self-identified skeptical warriors. There are such people, Google it. From the physicians who diligently read leading peer-reviewed publications in their field to the patrons who frequent local wellness centers. We have a wellness center at the recreation center. From the pharmaceutical company who advertises a new anti-cholesterol drug to the telemarketer who sells running shoes with separate toes, almost everyone wants science as their ally, or at least as their foe's foe. Here is a quotation from Pope John Paul II. He says, through its dynamism and its constant reaching out towards truth, science can give inspiration and a richer physical context or vision to other human sciences. It can share with them the results it has derived from its continuing investigations of the universal laws of nature. Science can finally lead humanity to bow before the creator of the universe, who from the Christian point of view is revealed as the Redeemer of man. Here's an excerpt from Nablusi Encyclopedia of Islam. The entry is called, I think, Scientific Miracles of Zamzam. Zamzam water is a natural spring water that is, I think, that is found near Kaaba, one of the major religious locations in Islam. About Zamzam water, here is what the encyclopedia says. Zamzam water is richest water in calcium. It reaches 200 milligrams in 1 liter. The words of the Prophet, may peace be upon him, were very true when he said, verily Zamzam is blessed. It's a food that nourishes and a healing for sickness. As you all know, the skeleton of the human being has the ability to renew its cells, and it has what is called destruction and destruction process. If one neglects his body's needs for calcium, the skeleton will be at risk of developing osteoporosis or this other disease, which is a serious disease, and in such cases, any fraction in the pelvic at an old age will be a disaster. What is common between these two excerpts? And I found them in 5 minutes on the internet. There are tons of them, not just by religious authorities, but by literally everyone, who tries to use some scientific argumentation, scientific rhetoric, in order to perhaps further their own ideological or non-ideological agendas. In these cases, it is religious. How is this possible? This is possible, I think, because most of the society, or a significant proportion of the population, respect science. They listen to scientists in a way they don't listen to other people, which is expressed perhaps in the words of even a higher authority, who says very frequently, you should have gone to medical school instead of studying philosophy. By now you would have already become a professor of medicine. Everyone would have listened to you then. Now no one cares. And this high authority is my mom. But notice, she is in a sense right. We all know that she is in a sense right. I am very glad that I didn't go to med school. I am very glad that I am a philosopher. But that doesn't change the fact that she is right about this observation. If I became a professor of medicine, more people would have taken my words seriously. More people would have been inclined to believe me more readily. I'm not trying to suggest that people like John Paul or the author of that encyclopedia or countless other fatwas that I encountered on the Islam which were issued by religious authorities in Islam. I'm not trying to suggest that the people who would like to command epistemic authority use scientific rhetoric because of their deep admiration for science. They use scientific rhetoric not necessarily because they themselves admire and trust science, but because their audience does. In this cultural setting, which I call cultural scientism, external critiques of science and scientific consensus are often marginalized as anti-vaccinists, global warming denialists, creationists. In most cases, I think these groups deserve such marginalization, for they closely follow the personal example of the very lovely Miss Bannister that we saw in the first video. They form opinions without informing themselves. They are, in a sense, failing as epistemic agents. But I think among the external critiques of science, there might occasionally be intelligent and well-informed people who are shouted down by self-proclaimed pro-science crowds, simply because they happen to not be completely on board with the scientific practice or consensus of their day. The cultural climate surrounding science leaves very little room for real criticism. In your arguments, you either show a special reverence to everything scientific, or you will suffer a great rhetorical disadvantage against people who employ scientific rhetoric. Criticism from within science is also strongly discouraged in some cases. Here's, for instance, what the US federal legislation said about what constitutes scientific misconduct. This was official policy of the National Science Foundation. Scientific misconduct is fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, or other practices that seriously deviate from those that are commonly accepted within the scientific community. This piece of legislation applied for 8 years. It was drafted by scientists. It was struck down eventually, not by the Supreme Court or our democratic will, but by the intense efforts by a handful of physicists who were led by the Caltech physicist David Goodstein, who argued that the underlying portion is just a very bad idea. Science should be open to criticism. But these things happen actually. People are accused, people were accused for scientific misconduct. simply because they simply disagreed with the practices or common beliefs of their colleagues. In other words, because of cultural scientism, it is difficult to utter the phrase, science is wrong on this, and be taken seriously by many people. If you want to be taken seriously, you need to use this rhetoric of science, even if your goals have nothing to do with science. For it is the rhetoric of science that convinces people to vote for you, believe your religion, buy your product, to follow you. This near total domination of culture, which I called cultural scientism, is alarming for several reasons. Cultural scientism is a unilateral power structure which bestows upon scientific rhetoric an aura of supreme epistemic authority. This perceived authority and the respected commands are often exploited in ways that ultimately harm the society. Claims that do not live up to even the loosest standards of critical thinking are made and sometimes taken as final answers because they are produced and warranted in an evidently scientific setting. As the recent and well-documented scandals of pharmaceutical research demonstrate. I will talk about these scandals towards the end. Famous philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, also worried about this situation, which was already on the horizon when he wrote this in 1975. He said, I want to defend society and its inhabitants from all ideologies, science included. All ideologies must be seen in perspective. One must not take them too seriously. One must read them like fairy tales, which have lots of interesting things to say, but which also contain wicked lies, or like ethical prescriptions which may be useful rules of thumb, but which are deadly when followed to the letter. So Feyerabend disagrees with medical doctors who think that science is how you discover the truth. For Feyerabend, scientific thinking has no special epistemic authority over other forms of thinking. That's why he advocated a formal separation between state and science. He said, in a democracy, scientific institutions, research programs, and suggestions must be subjected to public control. There must be a separation of state and science, just as there is a separation between state and religious institutions, and science should be taught as one view among many, and not as the one and only road to truth and reality. Even if you are convinced by Feyerabend's diagnosis, it's hard to accept and implement his solution. There are several reasons for this. First, as the history of my home country, the Republic of Turkey, not the turkey animal, although there is some relationship between the two names, illustrate very aptly, it is very difficult to maintain a separation between state and a form of rationality, when a significant part of the electoral population have an unquestioning endorsement of that form of rationality. If you don't know anything about Turkey, let me paraphrase. So the Turkey was originally the Ottoman Empire, which was a theocracy. It has an official religion, it discriminated against non-Muslims. It was impossible until the very late stages of the empire to hold any power in the society unless you were a Muslim. Ozturk, the general who founded the Turkish Republic and who is by and large responsible for its early constitution, decided that Turkey should be a secular nation, just like France. And he put it into the constitution. He removed almost everything that entails an entanglement between state and religion. He did everything perhaps he can do in order to make Turkey secular, but Turkey didn't become secular. And what is happening right now in Turkey is there's a backlash against secularism. Secularism was not functioning very well. Secularism was not endorsed by the public. So secularism, secular Turkish revolution failed. And what is happening in Turkey right now is Islamists are coming back to power. Don't think that I am making any evaluations, but I'm just stating the facts. Secularism, a separation between church and state, is unworkable if there is an overwhelming endorsement, unquestioning endorsement of the church among the population. As long as, especially when the population dictates the laws. So, cultural scientism is widespread, and unquestioning of endorsement of scientific rationality is widespread in Western cultures. Therefore, Paul Feyerabend's suggestion that we must have a separation between science and state is unworkable. It's not going to work. I am having difficulty separating my beliefs from scientific results. And here I am professing to criticize science. It's not going to work. We are not going to give up cultural scientism. There are also reasons to believe that the separation between state and science is not going to solve the problem. This is so because Feyerabend's diagnosis of the problem is incomplete. He is correct in his observation that cultural scientism harms the society. What is less obvious, but also culturally important, crucially important, is the fact that cultural scientism also harms science itself by diverting the practice of science away from its reason of being, finding the truth. In other words, cultural scientism is double trouble. It hurts not only the society, but also science itself. It hurts society by making ordinary citizens vulnerable to commercial, political, and moral exploitation in science's good name. It also hurts science by transforming science into an instrument of exploitation and misinformation, whose path is orthogonal to the normative paradigm of science. That normative paradigm I'm talking about is searching for the truth from a point of view that is as empirical and objective as humanly possible. This point seems to elude Feyerabend almost entirely. The only threat he perceives against science originates not from the society itself, but from rival ideologies. He says science can stand on its own feet and does not need any help from rationalists, secular humanists, Marxists, and similar religious movements. Science must be protected from ideologies. But as I shall document in reasonable detail, the most significant threat science is exposed to today is not infiltration by a rival ideology. It's rather the dysfunctional relationship between science and society that I called cultural scientism. The threat, in other words, is not this or that ideology taking over science, it is science dominating society. It originates from our culture's unquestioning acceptance of all things scientific, which creates legal and financial dynamics where science can no more function as it should. Therefore, the danger science faces because of cultural scientism is not ideological infiltration as Feyerabend predicts. It's the very same threat the society faces. That's why it's the society itself that we must defend science against, just like we must defend society against science. Cultural scientism, I will illustrate with examples, hurts science by creating conflicts of interest or exacerbating those conflicts of interest that already exist. These conflicts of interest are often not ideological in nature, but they still disrupt scientific research by making it overwhelmingly difficult for the producer and publisher of science to maintain their objectivity, which in turn hurts society. Some of these conflicts of interest are created by legislation, some are confined to the level of institutions and individual scientists. I will give you examples of all three, show you how they are causally connected to cultural scientism, and discuss what we can do to nullify them. This is in a compact form, the model I am offering. Cultural scientism is the cultural background. It leads to over or misguided incentivization of science, which creates an array of institutional, individual, or legislative conflicts of interest that leads to dysfunctional science, crap science. And crappy science hurts the society by making the population deceived, robbed, and misinformed, which creates a partial feedback loop, which makes people more prone to believe the authority because they are misinformed. This is the model I am offering. So what I'm suggesting is a remedy. Feyerabend's proposal is inadequate. The separation between science and state is neither a necessary nor a sufficient nor a plausible solution to the problem. We should instead target the conflicts of interest that are derailing science from its quest for truth and the over and misguided incentivization of scientific rhetoric that creates and perpetuates the cycle. What I'm suggesting is, since this is a feedback loop, if you break it here, the problem will disappear over time. So you don't have to actually start a philosophical crusade against cultural scientism, which is not going to go away. People are not going to listen to me and they will say, oh, you make sense. From now on, I will not be like Ozturk, I will think for myself. It's not going to happen. But if we eventually break the individual's institutional legislative conflicts of interest, this cycle will disappear, it will stop working, and hopefully at some point we will have a more informed population who have a healthier relationship to scientific authority. You are probably thinking, wait a minute, we aren't even convinced that there is a problem of crap science yet, or that your causal model of the problem is the correct one, let alone accepting your ideas about how to solve it. So let me convince you that there is a problem of crap science. It is caused, or at least greatly amplified by our culture's readiness to accept scientific claims, and that the most effective remedy to nullify or block the conflicts of interest that originate is to block the conflicts of interest that originate from this readiness. So, is there a problem? To convince you that there is a problem, I will first talk about retraction statistics. Recent analyses indicate that research retraction, which is what happens when someone publishes a paper in a scientific medium, like, for example, typically a journal, then that paper is retracted. In a sense, the publication decision is revoked in the future. That's called a retraction. Recent analyses indicate that research retraction and scientific misconduct are both on a steep rise, especially in health sciences, where stakes are higher and therefore conflicts of interest are more pronounced. For example, Randstein's 2011 data indicate that the total number of papers retracted per year increased sharply over the last decade. The rate of the increase in retractions is much greater than the rate of the increase in the total number of publications. The growth is exponential. That means, for example, the number of papers retracted, publications retracted between 2000 and 2010 is greater than the total number of retractions that happened in the history of science. Just one decade of retractions are more numerous than all retractions, all other retractions combined. This is bad news. This means results that do not live up to scientific standards somehow are sneaking past the peer review process, which is supposed to be upholding those standards. Perhaps more terrifyingly, there is an increase in the delayed retractions, which happens sometimes months or even years after the publication. In 2000, the longest delay before a retraction was 8 months, whereas it is now 108 months. So it is becoming more difficult to retract the paper. Steen's results are consistent with my own investigations. In order to determine the comparative trends of retraction and fraud in leading scientific publications, I went through all issues of the journal Science. This is arguably one of the 2 leading journals in empirical sciences, published between January 1971 and January 2011, and analyzed all the published retraction notices associated with retracted articles, investigation reports, and in some cases legal documents. During this period, a total of 67 research articles published in Science were officially retracted. Most retraction notices offered an explicit reason for retraction, 51 of them. In 16 cases, the reason was not explicitly stated in the retraction notice. So a typical retraction notice says, we regret to inform our audience, readership, that we are retracting the following article. Sometimes this is followed by an explanation why, a justification. They say it was due to a scientific mistake, it was due to an intentional scientific fraud, it was due to perhaps the inability to reproduce the results. But in 16 cases out of 67, there was no explanation. However, in 11 of these cases, I was able to determine the reason for the retraction by reading the relevant research ethics investigation reports or through personal communication with the authors of the retracted papers or retraction notices. In 5 cases, I was not able to determine any clear reason for the retraction. In 21 cases, the retraction was due to fraud. Somebody actually tried to cheat the system, and it got published. In 31 cases, it was a non-fraudulent scientific error. This is perhaps better news, but an error, a falsehood is a falsehood. It doesn't matter if it was intentional or not. Since it got passed through the screening of the peer review process, and it was read potentially by a very large number of scientists, and you can actually analyze its impact by counting the number of citations these papers received after publication, the problem is very large. In 19 cases, the retracted study was a physical science study. In the other cases, most of them were life sciences. So this is the result of the investigations in usual form. What you are seeing is the number of retractions in this single publication, Science, is increasing. And there is a very sharp, very distinct increase in the last decade. Here we observe that the retractions due to fraud have skyrocketed. It is the blue column. And we also see that the median and mean delay before retraction are also increasing. And here is a comparative analysis of what is going on in different areas of science, physical sciences, biological sciences, both of them saw increases in retracted publications. You might be thinking the fact that there is an exponential increase is not enough to establish an increase in bad science or attempted fraud. Perhaps scientific journals are becoming better at catching their mistakes. Just like, for example, the number of people who are incarcerated doesn't indicate that crime rate is actually increasing. The number of people who got caught for fraud or scientific mistakes increasing doesn't indicate that there is an actual increase in fraud or scientific mistakes. This is a very, I think, sensible question to ask. Unfortunately, the answer is, yeah, that question makes sense, but the increase is in part due to a real increase in fraud and misconduct. In the 2013 analysis, again by Steen, the author suggested that the incidence of retractions is due to mostly an increase of fraud coupled by a lesser increase of scientific mistakes. Something is happening to science, and whatever it is not good. So, there is a problem. So what is the source of the problem? Suppose I'm convinced you that there is a problem. What is the source of the problem? Previously, I claimed that the cause of the problem was cultural scientism, and the conflicts of interest created or escalated by it. In order to test this claim, we can compare the cases where the mentioned conflicts of interest are either absent or significantly less prone to cases where those conflicts of interest are present or significantly more pronounced. If we see a difference in dysfunctional science, then we can attribute that difference, I think, reasonably to the influence, negative effect of conflicts of interest. In many disciplines, even if there are no financial and individual conflicts of interest that would push the journals to publish some studies and reject others, there is still a strong bias towards positive results. Here's an example. In 2011, a researcher from Cornell conducted a series of experiments on precognition. Precognition basically is predicting the future. It is supposed to be some sort of perhaps psychic power. So this author, this scientist, researcher, conducted a series of experiments testing people for this psychic power. He got statistically significant results in, I think, 6 powers he tested out of 8, which is very impressive. This result got published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It is not the top journal in experimental psychology, but it is one of the better regarded, highly regarded journals, which is not too shabby. Then several different groups of psychologists, experimental psychologists, tried to replicate these results. They said, these results might be a fluke, right? There is always some chance that you will guess what's going to happen. That doesn't mean that you have psychic powers. Perhaps you were just lucky. The experimenter was perhaps just lucky. He happened to have a bunch of lucky people in his study group. So let's try to replicate this. Actually, 4 different groups tried to replicate it. They independently did their experiments. None of them came up with statistically significant positive results. They all sent their results, again independently, without communicating, collaborating with one another, to the same journal. And they got this response from the editor. The editor says, we are not interested in publishing negative results. We are just interested in publishing positive results. I just told you the background story, and now you don't believe in psychic powers, I hope. Because you realize that this was probably just chance, random luck. This was a fluke. But not everybody knows about the background story, because the background story doesn't get published. Because people, editors, publishers of science, also consumers of science, are not impressed by, usually, negative results. This is creating a bias towards positive results. As an objective reader, diligent reader of experimental psychological literature, when you read journals, what impression would you get? You see one study which shows that undergrads at Cornell have psychic powers. You have 0 studies which show that they don't. As an objective judge, what should you believe? So this is a problem. But so far I haven't said anything about what is happening in fields where this is a problem, even in a field where publishing such a study doesn't really make you a mountain of money. Yes, perhaps you publish something, there is another line on your CV, the institution gets some prestige, I suppose, by increasing their publication output. But no one is going to pay this Cornell professor millions and upon millions of dollars for publishing a precognition study. So there is no strong institutional or personal or legislative conflict of interest that is pushing people to put more emphasis on positive results. So let's compare this scenario, which is already awful, to cases in which there is a much stronger conflict of interest for publishing positive results. Unfortunately, these fields, like pharmaceutical research, are worse, much worse than experimental psychology in terms of publication bias, precisely because the stakes are high. There are billions of dollars and human lives involved, and as my mom frequently reminds me, everyone listens to medical researchers. Let's look at the examples. In March 2012, a survey article by the head of global cancer research was published in Nature. This is again a leading journal. The article contained the results of the studies which tried to replicate the positive findings of 53 landmark publications in cancer treatment. Unfortunately, 47 out of 53 could not be replicated. If you have taken any science courses or history of science classes, you probably remember, hopefully remember, replication is the hallmark of scientific research, scientific progress. If you cannot reproduce a result, then you cannot really trust it. Because science is supposed to be intersubjectively objective. Fellows like Michael should be able to test it and see for himself. If Michael replicates my studies, let's suppose he tries to go through the same retraction matrices, and he doesn't come up with these graphs, he comes up with different graphs, then you shouldn't trust me. So unfortunately, replication in so-called hallmark, and that's a quotation, cancer research is not very high. In 1980, medical researchers working for a pharmaceutical company, a private company, conducted a study on a drug called laude, I think is the pronunciation, which was an experimental anti-arrhythmic drug designed to prevent heart attacks. It made sense to develop this drug because medical researchers realized that people who suffer from heart attacks also happen to suffer from a condition called arrhythmia. Your heart doesn't beat regularly. They said perhaps the two are causally related. So if we design a chemical, come up with a chemical which prevents or treats arrhythmia, then perhaps it will reduce the rate of or risk of heart attacks. It made sense. They did their epistemic duty, they did their experiments, which were excellent. Their study, their experiments, yielded negative results, showing a higher mortality rate for people on drugs in comparison to placebo, the sugar pill. They said, oh, this was an interesting idea, but it is actually a bad idea. But because it was a negative result, they didn't or couldn't publish it. Because editors are not interested in publishing negative results. What happened? Independent pharmaceutical companies, not knowing about this negative result, came up with the same brilliant idea. They did experiments. One of them came up with a false positive, which indicated that the drug, the substance, reduces the risk of fatal heart attacks. The FDA approved of it, and the drug was marketed, widely prescribed, And after a decade of wide common use by patients who are just following science, doctors who are just doing their epistemic duty of following scientific publication, used it, and in the end, it became overwhelmingly clear from the clinical records of hospitals that this drug is killing people. Actually, the people who are on this drug have a higher incidence, much higher incidence of heart attacks than their peers who are not on the drug. The estimated number of people who die prematurely because of this drug is close to 100,000 Americans. So, if you think that the positive bias, or the publication bias for positive results is not dangerous, think again. In 2008, there was a survey article published in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that there were a total of 74 clinical trials on the leading 12 antidepressant drugs currently prescribed. It turns out that 36 of these trials yielded negative results. So out of 74, 36 yielded negative results, the rest yielded positive results. So the distribution of experiments is half-half. Half of them say that these drugs work, half of them say that they don't. What happened? Terrifyingly, only 3 of the negative results were published, although 33 out of 34 of all positive results got published. What is the impression a responsible reader of scientific literature would get? They would say there is overwhelming evidence in favor of these drugs because there are 33 positive studies published, just 3 negative studies. But underneath, there is actually a 50-50 division. Probably these drugs don't work. They are not different from placebo, even if they are not harmful. Finally, there are no meta-analyses that give us reliable estimates about how bad the global situation is in medicine. We know that publication bias affects every field of medicine. About half of the clinical trials get buried. They never see any publication. They are never read by ordinary consumers of science, like medical doctors, medical researchers in other fields. And positive findings are twice as likely to be published as negative findings. The emotional reaction we should all have is certainly outrage. But before anyone decides to storm Washington, D.C., and shoot everything that moves, I suggest we try to figure out exactly why this is happening. So why are publication bias and false positives so pervasive in medicine? In order to do something about the problem, we need to understand why the publication bias is more pervasive in medicine than other fields. The explanation has 3 components. First component is financial conflicts of interest created by the involvement of pharmaceutical companies in clinical trials skew clinical trials in ways that are prone to produce false or misleading positives. Second, journals have financial conflicts of interest that push them to publish positive clinical trials. Third, individual scientists are stuck between a rock and a hard place due to the legal framework of intellectual property rights, which is really a pain in the neck for everyone, I think. But especially seriously, these intellectual property rights laws and legal framework seriously threatens the transparency of pharmaceutical research. Let's look at these factors individually. Financial conflicts of interest created by the involvement of some pharmaceutical companies in clinical trials skew clinical trials in ways that are prone to produce false or misleading false positives, I say. So companies use several methods to skew the results in favor of the drugs they develop and market. In a horrifying paper, which is about these methods, the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, Robert Smith, declares medical journals are an extension of the marketing arm of pharmaceutical companies. You might say, Smith is a crackpot. He is perhaps a disgruntled former editor of this journal. If he is a crackpot, he is at least not a lone crackpot. Journals have developed into information laundering operations for the pharmaceutical industry, wrote Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, in March 2004. In the same year, Marcia Angel, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, lambasted the industry for becoming primarily a marketing machine and co-opting every institution that might stand in its way. Medical journals were conspicuously absent from her list of co-opted institutions, but she and Horton are not the only editors who have become increasingly queasy about the power and influence of the industry. Jerry Cassirer, another former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, argues that the industry has deflected the moral compasses of many physicians, and the editors of PLOS Medicine have declared that they will not become part of the cycle of dependency between journals and the pharmaceutical company industry. Something is clearly up. Sorry for the long quote. I just wanted the gravity of the situation to sink in a bit. I am going to explain to you now how this is happening. How the pharmaceutical industry, how does the pharmaceutical industry screw the results that are published? They use several tricks, including the following. They use multiple endpoints in the trial and select for publication those that give favorable results. Here's what this means. Suppose I am trying a new cancer drug. Cancer is a terrible disease. My mom has cancer. And when you have cancer, especially some forms of cancer, the odds may not be very favorable. So success in cancer treatment is usually measured in terms of not cure, but survivability of the patient. You measure the success of the drug by measuring how long the patient who is on the drug survives. What is the probability of that person surviving, for example, 5 years, 10 years, 3 months? That's how most clinical trials about cancer or cancer research measure success. What the pharmaceutical companies do is they record these survivability statistics. They look at their data and they realize, for example, that the new drug they invested millions of dollars developing is good at keeping people alive for the first 2 years, but then the survivability declines. It might be very well the case that the survivability declines afterwards in comparison to the competitors. What they do is, knowingly they say that the trial ended at the 2-year mark. And they say, oh, look at this new shiny and coincidentally expensive drug. It will make you more likely to survive. And it gets published. They do multi-center trials and select for publication results from centers that are favorable. Testing the same thing in multiple independent centers might sound like a very good idea, but it is a terrible idea. Here is why. Suppose a scientist is measuring the relationship between two variables, and he comes up with, let's say, 12 data points. And he notices that if he gets rid of 6 data points, he will have a very neat curve. But the other 6 points are all over the place. They don't fit any coherent curve at all. So he says, okay, I'm just going to pretend that I didn't take those 6 measurements. If you do that in an individual study, that's scientific fraud. You can go to prison for it if you use federal money. If you didn't, then your career hopefully will be over. And the paper, if it gets published, it will be retracted. But this is in effect what is happening when pharmaceutical companies do multi-center trials. They do the same experiment maybe 20 times in different settings, and as a result of the normal natural luck involved in the randomness involved in the scientific process, they might get a positive result, although the rest of the 19 results are all negative. They publish the positive one and bury the negative ones. They similarly conduct subgroup analyses and select for publication those that are favorable. They actually modify their sample after they get the data. They say, okay, we did this experiment, but since Burkay's mom actually passed away early, we are just going to remove her from the sample. Present results, they present results that are most likely to express, for example, reduction in relative rather than absolute risk. They say things like, oh, this drug reduces the risk of a fatal heart attack by 50%. If the risk of a fatal heart attack is 0.001% to begin with, a 50% reduction is really not a great thing, and since every drug has side effects, probably it will be outweighed. This benefit, this 50% reduction, is going to be outweighed by the potential dangers of the side effects. You should be asking, how come? Why? Why on earth medical journals would be publishing these clearly problematic results? How could this happen? Why do journals publish these trials? Because of the conflicts of interest created by our willingness to pay unreasonable premiums for products backed up by ostensibly scientific rhetoric. Remember, doing the same experiment 20 times is expensive. Because doing an experiment once is expensive. Scientific research is expensive. But notice, the pharmaceutical companies have somehow the financial ability to repeat the same experiment again and again, in some cases until they hit, by random luck, a false positive, which is very unlikely. How are they making up that much money? Before we start blaming the big pharma, I think we should think about our own choices as consumers. We are enabling this system. I understand that the United States is a very well-functioning democracy. It is, in some regards, perhaps worse than my own not very well-functioning democracy, the Republic of Turkey. But as much as we have any control over legislation in the society, we should accept responsibility for the situation. Our willingness to accept scientific rhetoric, our willingness to pay outrageous amounts for drugs that cost pennies, basically, to produce, is enabling the system. But I didn't answer the entire question. You might still be worried that how can pharmaceutical companies convince the journal editors to publish these things? After all, these people are not all corrupt. Most of them are hardworking, honest scientists. They are unusually intelligent people. They are not idiots. So what is going on? Here is what is going on. A large trial published in a major journal has the journal's stamp of approval. It will be distributed around the world and may well receive global media coverage, particularly if promoted simultaneously by press releases from both the journal and the expensive public relations firm hired by the pharmaceutical company that sponsored the trial. For a drug company, a favorable trial is worth thousands of pages of advertising, which is why a company will sometimes spend upwards of $1 million on reprints of the trial for worldwide distribution. The doctors receiving the reprints may not read them, but they will be impressed by the name of the journal from which they come. The quality of the journal will bless the quality of the trial. So imagine that you are a journal editor. You are sent a clinical trial study from Pfizer, a leading drug company, which reports a breakthrough in cancer survivability. If you publish this result, you know that Pfizer is going to pay your journal perhaps close to $1 million and order reprints to distribute around the world, to send to medical doctors. Because people believe science, people demand science. So, you are basically facing a very difficult choice. You can maintain a skeptical attitude and say, I won't publish this until I see replications. Or you can just sign the bottom line and you will be handed $1 million. So in one way, the options, the choice that is, the offer that is given to the journal editors is an offer they cannot refuse. If, suppose Michael is a journal editor, he refuses to publish, the journal is going to fire him and perhaps hire me, who will sign the bottom line. So individual rebellion is not going to solve the problem. You might be tempted to, at this point, think that the problem is the big pharma, the evil pharmaceutical companies that corrupt everything because they are greedy. The big pharma, although they are evil, I think they are not the source of the problem. So it would be a mistake to think that they are causing this problem. The big pharma is instead merely a manifestation of the problem, not its root cause. Here is an example which shows that even without pharmaceutical industry, conflicts of interest still lead to severe failures of objectivity in medicine. During the last decade, a novel and growing medium of scientific publishing has emerged within the internet. Open access journals. Great idea. If you have ever hit a paywall, which is the concept that since, for example, most journals charge their readership, their subscribers, fees to reveal, share their contents, sometimes you are individually or your institution as a whole is not subscribed to a journal. So you go to their website or you go to your local university library and you can't find the paper. You can't access the paper you are looking for. In these cases, what is happening is the publication industry is benefiting from these fees. Some people came up with the brilliant idea of making it open access and charging the authors instead of the subscribers. What happened is the creation of a whole bunch of new journals called open access journals. These journals are different from their traditional counterparts. They exist only as online media. They do not issue reprinted copies. They do not charge their subscribers. Instead, they fund their operations by assessing their contributing authors' fixed or per-page publications. Like some of their traditional counterparts, open access journals too claim to apply peer review. And they have these statements: we are very committed to peer review, we have very high academic standards. intrigued by this, but they have a conflict of interest because they want to make money as journalists, so they want to publish more. This creates a conflict of interest that has nothing to do with the pharmaceutical industry. What happens then is, intrigued by this conflict of interest, Harvard biologist John Behanen recently conducted a study to test how rigorous peer-review process is really in medical journals specializing in clinical cancer research. Using a pseudonym, he submitted a fake research paper to a number of open access journals. The paper was horrible, but it reported a positive breakthrough. It was obviously horrible. It wasn't subtle. He submitted it to 157 journals. It got unconditionally accepted by 155. It got unconditionally rejected by 2. So, the problem, I think, exists. It is caused by the conflicts of interest, but not by evil people. So what should we do about it? Should we follow Per Robin's advice? Should we impose a separation between science and society? I think this is not going to solve the problem. Because I think Per Robin is wrong in his diagnosis. His diagnosis is incomplete. Science is not threatened by just ideologies. It is threatened by our own obsession with science. So we are obsessed with science. We are usually cultural scientists. That creates a drive, a push for over-incentivizing scientific rhetoric that creates individual conflicts of interest that leads to crap science, which in turn harms the society. So the reason why we should protect science from society and society from science is not because of an ideological conflict, it is because of conflicts of interest. So what then we can do instead? I will suggest 3 things very briefly. Healthcare reform. Don't let big pharma inflate prices, because inflated prices lead to bigger profits. Bigger profits give them more wiggle room in terms of manipulating the system. Education reform. Design curricula so that our students do not end up being boulders with higher education degrees. Create more philosophy classes. Intellectual property rights reform. Do not let interest groups own technologies or make money from publications of scientific research. So, these are my recommendations. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions.
Yes, Dave.
I have a couple of questions. I guess I'm a little puzzled, and I'm not sure exactly what your thesis was here, but there's something wrong with the science concerning pharmaceuticals. So that came through pretty clearly. Exactly what's wrong was a little less clear to me, and so let me just say. So here I am. I'm working for the FDA. Maybe they've changed the structure of the FDA and they just say, right, all drugs have to be approved by Hilbert.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I've got this application to approve a drug for some condition, and now I'm trying to decide, should I approve this drug? What should I do? Right. So I shouldn't look at pharmaceutical drug research, according to you, because that's evil and corrupt. But of course, I have to decide, right? You know, is this drug going to be allowed to be marketed, or is it not going to be allowed to be marketed? On what basis? What kind of evidence, right? So what should I be doing in order to answer this question?
So what you should do to answer this question is, perhaps this is going to help to see what the scope of the reform I'm suggesting is. In the setting, nothing, because there is very little you can do. What should be done instead, the publishing structure the
let me just
scientific
interrupt, by the way, and we'll just add this to the description of my epistemic situation, that I am like the real FDA in that I have access to all the data, not just the published data.
Well, that's actually one of the, I think, disagreements we might be having about what the facts are. In some cases, these trials that are eventually published are not registered. There were several moves, several campaigns for universal registration of all drug
Let me
trials.
just, that's actually a separate issue. That was for the public. The FDA has always had access. So if you're a pharmaceutical company and you submit a new drug application, you have to give them all your data. And if you're caught cheating on that, you're doomed. And there have been a few cases, but very few companies have actually, so the registry was to make publicly accessible. So there's two separate things going on here. There's the marketing, and on the marketing side, right, so I'm in total agreement that the abuse by pharmaceutical companies of the scientific literature for marketing their approved medications, it's a scandal, it's a horrible thing, the good news is various kinds of reforms are slowly being made, but it's a terrible, terrible thing. But for the purpose of approving drugs for marketing, the FDA has, as it were, always had the registry, and the companies have always had to turn over all the data, both positive and negative.
So in that case, I think FDA is a textbook case of agency capture. They are approving drugs that are scandalous.
Of course, they disapprove a lot of drugs, more than they approve.
Yes.
But the question is, so I'm the FDA and I get this pile of data, what do I do? Do I look at it? Is that scientism? Do I not look at it? Because to look at it would be scientism? This is the part of your talk that I didn't really understand. Sure. So I want to set aside all these factual issues. Let's be philosophers. Yeah. And we're just going to idealize, right? So there's a pile of data that's generated via scientific methods, via randomized controlled trials, following methods that I am the FDA after all, and I tell you what kind of data it is. I have the power to tell you what kind of data it is that I want to look at, right? That's why it's good that I'm the FDA. So what should I be telling the drug companies to do, given that my role is to decide which drugs can be marketed or not? Because the reason they do the randomized control trials is because that's what the FDA tells them to do.
Yeah, sure. I don't know enough about this subject, I suppose, to answer this question.
See, I wanted to say, look, we should get the best scientific evidence we can, but that now sounds like just cultural scientism.
But
and that's something that's...
I think I was misunderstood in this regard. Cultural scientism is not to take science seriously. It is not to listen to scientists. It is listening to scientists uncritically, unquestioningly, as if they have some sort of special access to the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So if FDA approves of drugs that are produced by scientific investigation process, that doesn't meet standards of critical thinking, then FDA is failing. So what I'm telling to the FDA is to not be cultural scientists either. So they should listen to scientists, but they shouldn't listen to scientists blindly. Which might be the reason why they are approving of these drugs that are not really meeting the standards of, considered standards of scientists, like this editor of the journal that I quoted.
And would that go back into what you were saying about just the conflict of interest of it, having the science actually turn in this data directly to say the FDA to approve or disapprove it?
Can you paraphrase the question? I'm not.
Well, that's what you were saying. That would be more of the conflict of interest. That would be the issue there with having, one party deliver it directly to the FDA, which would be the scientists. So you're having the people who are actually coming up with the data, delivering to the people who are asking for. Me bringing in that kind of conflict of interest and no third party or intermediate to kind of make sure.
No, conflicts of interest are not caused by just the company or the person who delivers the data. Scientists themselves are usually trapped in situations that involve conflicts of interest as well. For example, recently there was this revelation about DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for mental illnesses. One of the major authors of DSM-5 was revealed to have conflicts of interest himself. He was a shareholder of a company which was planning to monetize one of the scales they were proposing in the new edition of DSM-5 for measuring depression. So in this scenario, the scientist and the pharmaceutical company are not really distinguishable from one another. So just removing the third parties or the financial interest groups or corporations is not going to solve the problem. We should, as a society, do something about the over-incentivization of science. Scientists, scientific rhetoric shouldn't make as much money as it is now making. Yes?
I had a question about the data you showed us about the number of articles retracted from different journals. But before I get to that, just to be sure I understand what you framed as a bias towards positive results.
Yes.
Am I correct in that this is somewhat like the quote which is attributed to Einstein? I don't know if he really said it, but that no amount of evidence can prove me right, but any amount of evidence can prove me wrong. Or as one of my teachers once rephrased it, you can't prove that a platypus doesn't lay eggs by collecting 7,000 hours of videos of a platypi not laying eggs, right? That's the bias that they're working with, I assume, right? They don't want all this boring non-evidence, right?
Yeah.
But, oh, sorry.
I
Go ahead and tell me that's right, and then I'll ask my real question.
Now, you are onto something. I'm not sure if you are right or not right, because I'm not sure where you are headed to with this. But let me acknowledge what I think is very interesting and insightful in your observation. The confirmation bias, or the bias for publishing, more correctly, publishing positive results, is against this Popperian tradition of valuing false results more than valuing negative results more than positive results. So there is a conflict between the dying generation of Popperians who think that what is important in science is falsifiability. We never confirm our results, so people shouldn't go crazy about positive results. People should use those tests, those data, in order to disconfirm conjectures and theories, not to prove them or confirm them. Yes.
And so my question was, we saw that it was the biological sciences that had, they were ahead of the pack in the number of retractions.
Yeah.
So it's a two-part question. I'm wondering if you have any sense of why biological science was far and away above the other fields, including physical and behavioral, and whether you have a sense of which of the fields had the most retractions due to fraud. Because it was equally due, the two high bars were fraud and error.
Yeah, let's go back to the graphs. So as you are telling us, you are right, there is a difference between the number of retractions that happened in biological sciences, which is the orange column, in comparison to physical sciences, which is the blue column. And there is, in both cases, fraud is very dominant. Actually, this is not apparent in the graphs, but when you think about, when you compare the number of fraud-related retractions to error-related retractions, they are more common in physics. But I think that's a fluke, because most of the retractions in physical sciences come from just one case. Jan Hendrik Schoen, who was a brilliant physicist, young physicist, who fake data in a large number of papers, and they got published in leading journals, after which they got retracted. We get this large column. Without Jan Hendrik Schön, the number of retractions in physics would have been much lower. The number of retractions related to fraud would have been lower too. So in a sense, this is again supporting my belief that conflicts of interest are exacerbating or creating the problem, because conflicts of interest, because of the money involved, are much stronger in biological sciences, life sciences, than in physical sciences. And again, to reinforce this point, the field of physical science in which Jan Hendrik Schön was working was again a money-making field. It wasn't just particle physics, it wasn't just theoretical physics, it was organic superconductor research, which is promising, which was promising when he was doing his research, making billions upon billions of dollars by revolutionizing how computers work. So the higher the stakes are, the more prone the system to fail.
But if I understood what you just said, wouldn't it be true then that the high number of retractions in biological sciences are due to error and not to fraud? If that fraud bar is being pumped up by that one guy.
Yeah. What I'm saying is not that scientists are or charlatans or scoundrels. What I'm saying is, in some cases, they make errors. Not because they are trying to cheat the system, but because they are not really trying very hard to double check, which is again an incentive, right, and created by the high stakes. Josh.
So you brought up Schön, and so I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
And I'll do that one first. You know, in his situation, this is going to be somewhat speculative, but I'm going to say something that corresponds with what you were saying with respect to the incentives we give to scientists as part of our culture.
Yeah.
You know, Schön, presumably he wasn't on the bill, he wasn't getting paid by some company to fake his results. My impression of the situation was that he enjoyed a particular position at a university or at the lab, the Bell's lab.
At the Bell Labs.
And my impression was that it was his tenured position and the acclaim he got for his research, quote-unquote research, which motivated his and not a financial incentive. Is that correct?
No, in a sense, it is a financial incentive, but it is not an institutional financial incentive. The Bell Labs actually did everything they could do to investigate this scandal transparently, and they did a fantastic job at the end. They documented the reasons why this happened in a very detailed report. But what enabled or what moved Jan Hendrik Schön to cheating the system, or try to cheat the system, is a personal conflict of interest. He wants to publish, he is under tremendous pressure to publish. The Bell Labs is a place that you would literally perish if you don't publish. So that perhaps is, again, causing the problem to be, yes, more significant. Yes?
Okay, so then the idea is, so again, I want to come back to something Dave said. In fact, the idea then is, I mean, presumably he published enough to not have perished, but he continued publishing. I mean, the amount of his publication was enormous. People are remarked that he's like, you know, the golden child. He didn't stop at a sufficient number to get his, tenure. He just kept going. My speculation was that there's other sorts of incentives besides monetary that our society gives to scientists and their brilliance or whatever. And so my point is, if one was, I hope my point is actually justified by this case, but my point that I hope to say is that whatever it is, if we're going to if we're going to remove some of the incentives we place on scientists and thereby clean up scientists, we don't get as much crap science. It's not just a monetary thing, right? It's these other sorts of incentives scientists get by being part of our society.
Schön actually published one research paper per 8 weeks for almost 2 years. And they were published in top places. Right. So it is not just about money, it is not just about keeping his tenure. He was aiming for this incentive, Nobel Prize. that is again created by the society, and you are right, it is not just commercial, it is not just financial.
So getting back to my original question, Dave, you were saying, what would you do as part of the FDA if you have all the data, right? That was the question, Dave?
Sure.
Okay. Well, presumably if the FDA has all the data, they have all even the negative trials, et cetera, then they'd be in a position not to fall into scientism, right? They would be in a position to evaluate science with respect to all the data available and make a rational and good decision. So that's right.
Precise.
Yeah, so this is a sort of follow-up to Dave's question that we touched before the back up. So I was thinking about...
By the way, I have a bias towards philosophers. Just somebody should take over the responsibility.
So if you think about the FDA's choices, one way to think about that is not just what method should they use to approve drugs, but as it were, where should they set the bar? It is, should they favor approving too many drugs in the hopes of approving useful drugs that would otherwise get screened out, or should they aim to approve too few drugs in the hopes of not approving dangerous ones? And that's a social decision, as it were, that's not based on science alone. Arguably, right, I mean, there was a fair amount of activism in the mid-'80s because of AIDS to change the way the FDA approved drugs because people thought that they weren't approving AIDS drugs fast enough, right? And I don't know the legislative history of how the FDA shifted in the period you're looking at. But it would be interesting to sort of add that into your story. But it's not obvious to me that it's wrong. I mean, so two things. One is it's not obvious to me that it's a wrong choice of a society to decide that it's going to approve to err on the side of approving too many drugs rather than approving too few drugs. And the which is to look more favorably on positive evidence for that reason. And the second thing is whether or not one way to think about how this relates to your question is, are you suggesting that as a society or as an agency, the FDA ought to be doing this with an awareness of our cultural biases and the way in which approved drugs are then going to get misunderstood and misused by the public? I mean, so as it were, cultural scientism might be an argument then for the FDA to go back to a more restrictive model of drug approval.
This is an interesting point. Yeah, I think pitching the situation in terms of a dichotomy between approving a higher number of drugs versus a lower number of drugs is a bit mistaken. What we should do is, there is a social aspect of the decision, you are right, and there is an extra-social, mathematical aspect of the decision, which is not really scientific, it is a matter of logic. There is a principle called the total evidence principle. When you make a decision about an empirical thesis, when you make a probability assessment, you need to evaluate, you need to look at all the evidence you have, not just some subparts. So that's Josh's point. That's a mathematical point. The society has nothing to do with it. No matter how many people again votes against it, it is still a theorem. It is still true. But there is something interesting in what you suggested. There is a social element which is built into the decision, which is in part made by applying the total evidence principle. Even then you look at the total evidence and you get a probability assessment. Still, the amount of risk-taking, which is justifiable or desirable, is a social decision. And it is extra-scientific. That decision should not be made by experts. That decision should not be made by people who are not going to live or die due to the result of that decision. I think that decision should be left to a well-functioning democratic body. That answers the question. Again, this is an anti-cultural scientific point.
How about one more from a non-philosopher?
First of all, with regards to the questions which have been emerging with regard to the FDA, I'm not specifically convinced by any of the solutions that I've heard with regards to the FDA, for the simple reason that it strikes me that the FDA as an institution itself would be ripe for corruption. as soon as we have a location, a center, which is making decisions of any sort, that simply becomes a magnet towards whatever sorts of interests there are in order to be manipulated. So anyway, I think there's a whole problem in putting too much power into any entity called the FDA or anything like it. Aside from that, that's not my real question. My real question has to do with, let me grant you the argument, and I think I share it. The basic argument that you're making, the thesis, is that at some level there's a kind of cultural scientism that's occurred. Science has been too incentivized in some fashion, to use your language. And as a result, we have created this entity that draws us towards it. Let's grant that. Your solution, as I understand it, seems to be some version of critical thinking, that you open that up with critical thinking, and then in your last set of solutions, education, etc., seem to be critical thinking as well, or something like it. And frankly, I don't know that you can give a very coherent account of critical thinking, because I have a serious doubt that anybody can give a very coherent account of critical thinking. Is it, so that's my basic question. What is it in your view? How does it function? What is its methods of operating? Is it a practice, a skill which emerges slowly but surely after being in contact with all kinds of world problems? Is it something that can be isolated from motive? Can it actually function as an entity out here which is free of its own worldly, bodily kinds of concerns? So how would you propose to correct the problem through some, seems to me, almost magical entity called critical thinking?
Excellent question. Actually, this is a conversation John and I had been having. I was basically defending this critical point of view against critical thinking, which is the class John has been teaching this semester. And briefly, very shortly, my answer is I don't have an answer. But that's not because I don't have anything to suggest in terms of making education more effective, but because I don't have a short answer that will solve our problems. I don't think that I have a definition of critical thinking which will work. But what we can do in especially critical thinking classes, and this is, I think, one of the ideas John suggested, is to, instead of focusing on the old school, traditional, logical fallacies which exist only in symbols in logic textbooks, we should look at examples of failures which are relevant, which are interesting, which happen in everyday life. We should have exercises, I think, based on scenarios, some of which I mentioned today. And then we should perhaps open up discussion, not as teachers, not as lecturers, not as people who are handing out Plato's infinite wisdom to undergraduates who don't know how to think, but as fellow citizens or as persons who will have to figure out how to resolve these problems which happen not in the abstract logical space, but in real life. In the FDA perhaps, in the publication board of a medical journal. But that doesn't satisfy you, that doesn't satisfy me either.
Well, on that note, let's thank Burkay and carry on a little informal. It's absolutely just so beautiful. Thanks, Burkay. Very good.
I have a lot of questions. Will we have time to think about
I didn't really know what I was doing. Like, it's my students, but it's like, I don't really need to.
It's not about
I think I agree with some of the things you were saying at the end about, to that question about, just, I mean, you don't, like a general definition.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you look at particular cases, I mean, you look at cases like
Thank you so much.
California legislature is trying to figure out whether they should modify technical bulletin 117. Furniture safety. And then you look at the way that they went out trying to assess this.
Use it or